So for this next session, I would like to introduce Jen Kovecses, who works at the Salazar Center, who will in turn introduce the speakers and moderate the panel. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Dave, for that introduction. And as Dave mentioned, we're going to start digging into thinking about our global biodiversity targets. I think all of us know in this room, I don't need to explain, that a few years ago we all committed globally, or most of us country-wise committed globally to the Global Biodiversity Framework. In the US, of course, that was not part of the commitments, but prior to this administration, the US was on track to building its own frameworks and own goals around biodiversity. So today, our panelists are gonna help us think about whether we're on track to meeting those goals. At this moment in time, we're about 5 years out from that 2030 target, which is a vanishingly small amount of time. So we have 3 experts with us today from across the continent who are gonna help us shape and think about whether we're on track to meeting those goals, what does that look like for us across the continent in thinking about those targets. And specifically, we're gonna focus a little bit more on the target 3, the 30% effort. So first, today we have Brian O'Donnell, who's the director for the Campaign for Nature, and then we'll hear from Lucia Ruiz Bustos, who's the Conservation Areas Director for World Wildlife Funds, and then lastly we'll hear from Kirsten Scott, the National Program Manager for Land and Freshwater Conservation with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. So first, go ahead, Brian.
Well, thanks, Jen, and thanks to the Salazar Center for bringing us all together. We're grateful for that. I'm going to talk about where the United States stands in the 30 by 30 target, so not all good news coming up, just a little foreshadowing in case anyone was wondering. But before doing that, I thought it was important to remind everyone, like, why do we have this 30 by 30 target? It's not just a nice to have. This is a fundamental target if we're going to address the biodiversity and climate crisis. Some of you in this room, I believe, worked on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Global Assessment. I think there's one down there, yes, the IPBES, which was in May of 2019, this was the largest ever assessment of the state of biodiversity on the planet, with 145 experts, including one in the room, from 50 countries, conducted over several years, and it incorporated both Western science and indigenous knowledge, and its conclusions said that it really was a gut punch for all of us who read it. It said that nature is declining at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating with grave impacts for people around the world. They said we're eroding our very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide, with up to 1 million species facing extinction, many within decades. So we've got a huge extinction threat coming towards us. We also have a massive loss of abundance of species. And then we also have a similar challenge on the climate side of things. The IPCC had a report that said we need to protect at least 30% to more than 50% of lands and oceans if we're going to address climate goals. So this is a fundamental target for life on Earth, for biodiversity, and for climate. So this target of 30 by 30 addressed some of the main issues related to these problems. For biodiversity, habitat loss and overexploitation are the biggest challenges. Overexploitation in the oceans, habitat loss on land. So you need a target that's going to address those issues. And you need something that's also going to address the time scale. We have a pace of loss that is so accelerating that we need that second 30, the 2030 part. We also need to focus on the other components of the target, the equity, the effective management and connectivity to make sure this works. So where do we stand on 30 by 30? Well, at the beginning of the target, when Joe Biden was president, we saw him issue an executive order on the first week in office. It was the first of its kind national conservation goal of conserving 30% of the U.S. lands and waters by 2030. And he expanded on this commitment by creating a thing called the America the Beautiful Initiative. To be honest, it took the Biden administration quite a while to get going on implementing that. It was a great start to have that big target early on in the administration. It was a slow start where much of the administration then spent time kind of debating what counts as 30 by 30. But once they did kind of come around, they did accelerate quickly and start to do some major conservation endeavors. That included 15 new national monuments that were either expanded or restored. And they added 9 million acres of protections in those monuments. They also focused on tribally led conservation, including the 848,000 acres of sacred tribal lands in California, in the desert, the Chuckwalla and Satitla Highlands National Monuments, which were done at the tail end of the Biden administration, and really important national monument designations. They protected critically important ecological areas in Alaska, 28 million acres removed from oil and gas and other extractive industries, and they withdrew 625 million acres on the U.S. coastlines from oil and gas leasing. They created 3 new marine sanctuaries, 6 new wildlife refuges. So quite a extensive conservation record for the Biden administration, especially in the final years, and something to build off of and real momentum towards 30 by 30. I see Stephanie here who worked hard on that, so thank you, Stephanie, and others in the Biden administration. There were some shortcomings, though, from an ecological perspective, and you'll hear this from Angela later. Many of the marine conservation efforts still remain in the U.S. in the remote areas of the Pacific, with very little progress on the more near-shore areas where we need to see more of the marine protected areas done. We also need to have quite a bit of work to do in the United States on the private land in the southeastern United States, which is where biodiversity is concentrated. We saw states that have had 30 by 30 plans in California, really incredible plan in California, Hawaii, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont all had statewide 30 by 30 plans going forward, and they still do, so that's some reason to be hopeful. But that brings us to the current administration. The Trump administration is now taking a wrecking ball to the 30 by 30 agenda, as well as the entire conservation agenda. On federal lands, we're seeing really a horrendous attack on nature, the largest attack on nature that we've seen in generations. And we're seeing it being done in the name of an extractive land rush, where they are using phrases like energy dominance, drill baby drill. They've signed executive orders calling for immediate and massive expansion of logging on public lands. They've claimed the need to mine virtually everywhere, including in the deep sea, calling for the next gold rush. They've pursued rollbacks of pollution regulation, plans to sell federal lands. They have plans to eliminate or weaken national monuments with no public process, even those that were done with unanimous local community or tribal support. They have plans to transfer national parks to the states, many of which have very low standards for management. They're gutting conservation budgets, weakening the Endangered Species Act. We've seen mass layoffs of federal workers, many of whom safeguard lands, waters, cultural sites, and wildlife. We've seen huge cuts or elimination of monitoring and science programs, and they've eliminated the USAID programs for international conservation budgets. And they're really robbing future generations of their natural and cultural heritage. Much of this agenda will be challenged in court, and I'm hoping that much of it won't survive, but some of it will. So we will take some real losses in biodiversity. And at the end of this administration, on the federal level, they will move us further away from 30 by 30 than closer to it. So this is really a time for all of us to have sort of an uprising for nature, something that we cannot ignore. But we need to do it in a way, in my mind, that decides, as Dallas said earlier, what's the long-term agenda that we all stand for? Will we be a speed bump in Trump's agenda, or will his policies be a speed bump in ours, or a tope, or what do they call them, speed humps here in Canada? So make sure I'm appropriate for North America. But that's the attitude that we need to have, is where do we position ourselves in challenging this agenda? And I know we've got other panelists, I don't want to take up too much time, but it is critically important that we position the threats that we're seeing, and they are real and dangerous threats from the Trump administration, in ways that we can advance the ball in the long term, and do that through philanthropy, civil society, subnational organizations, and local work to build the long-term support for conservation.
Great, I guess it's my turn. So I wanted to begin with a reflection of what you think about when we think about transboundary efforts in North America. So you might be thinking about the Great Plains or the Rocky Mountains. Over 500 million people living in our 3 countries. Over 5,000 species of fish, 4,000 different types of arachnids or spiders, and over 900 species of birds. But we also have migrating species. And this is a story that we need to tell ourselves on how we connect the species with the humans that are living those stories. And this continent speaks 3 official languages and hundreds of indigenous ones, many of which are endangered and each carrying wisdom that was stewarded for centuries. But yet, with all of this richness, our relationship with nature across our continent is at a crossroads. And this is where we can come up with solutions. So I had the privilege of contributing last year to WWF's emblematic biannual report, which is called Living Planet Report. And we focused a lot on the tipping points. Where are we getting into those tipping points where there's no way back and that we will need to face that reality? And we focused a lot on 4 things. Conservation, how can we address this through 30 by 30 and other conservation efforts? Acting, what are the type of things that will make sure that we have impact? Safeguarding local rights, but also fair and being equitable. And what do we need to avoid to make sure that we don't get through those tipping points? And what we realized when we were analyzing how we are advancing in terms of these 4 topics related to tipping points, we realized that we are having a lot of commitments, but we're not standing up to them. So the reflection that I want to bring today is, how are we engaging with each other? How are we engaging within our agendas and across agendas? Conservation, we need to open the dialogues. We need to be open, to be listening, and to be hearing from others. We agree to disagree, but we do need to face those different reflections, different standpoints. So we're so focused on the challenges that we aren't listening to each other. And it's an interesting moment of polarization. What about joining the dots by facilitating dialogues? And that's what we have been focusing on as WWF, facilitating dialogues between different stakeholders to make sure that we're listening to different parts of the story, their different visions. And in this perspective, I wanted to make reference to quality. So if we're talking about 30 by 30, we should not only make it about the quantity, but also the quality. The quality about connectivity, those sites that we want to include, but also about fairness, equity, inclusive governance, and also effective management. What does effective management really mean? And at what scale do we want to report this? And I just wanted to make a reflection on the quality of ecosystems is also a transboundary thing. We have species going from Canada to Mexico every winter, like the monarch butterflies. We need to make sure that the quality is maintained throughout the corridors, not only in one space where it is hibernating or where it lives in the summer. So how do we think more about the qualitative elements and connectivity and effective management of those sites, bringing people into conservation? Something that I want to share as well is subnational approaches. We realized in the last administration in Mexico that it was going to be super difficult to work at a federal level. So we went into realizing that another way of having impact was having subnational approaches to make sure that we could empower local voices. And finally, how do we get to those narratives that are being super difficult to address? What are those topics that people in these current administrations are worried about? And something that we have been discussing is national security topics are becoming a priority. Jobs, talking about how nature relates to jobs, recognition and respect of rights. How can we merge both things to make sure that we're talking about national security in terms of what our countries are addressing? And in this sense, for us, rangers in its broadest meaning, not only those hired by the governments, but also those community rangers that are making the difference. So how do we meet those continental goals while honoring local realities? We do it by working together. And we have been also trying to say, how can we collaborate, and listen to each other, making sure that we are not closing ourselves only to talking about conservation. And in this sense, I think Dallas was also talking about the ecological, economy, and social perspectives, but we need to link that. How do we link them? Through collaborating. And finally, a saying that is very famous in Mexico, mi casa es tu casa. If you win, I win. We need to make this collaborative effort to make sure that it's not only my win or Canada's win or the US win, but it's a transboundary win for everyone. So North America's story is a living one, and we need to keep on advancing to make sure that we collaborate, that we focus on quality, that we focus on national security, and that we also empower those subnational efforts. Thank you. And over to you, Jen.
Some of those things too, and some tangible examples. So I work for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society's national office. CPAWS also has chapters in most provinces and territories. These work quite independently and on the ground in each Canadian jurisdiction. And our focus at the national office is on federal policy, funding, and decision-making. We have a 60-plus year history as Canada's only charity dedicated to the protection of land, fresh water, and ocean. And we try to work in a way that respects the sovereignty and leadership of Indigenous nations and focuses on conserving nature to respond to the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. CPAWS has played a role in protecting over 500,000 square kilometers, and I'm sorry, I can't translate that into miles for our American colleagues here, but my presentation is going to focus on a recent report that we did. So, as some background, in June 2022, we published the roadmap to 2030, which summarized the actions needed to implement 30 by 30 and viable conservation opportunities and potential challenges in each jurisdiction. As we know, Canada made a formal commitment to the GBF in December 2022. So from this work in 2022, 6 recommendations emerged around successful conservation progress. And fast forward to last year, midway through the decade to 2030. So for our next report, we turned these recommendations into questions asking how or if federal, provincial, and territorial governments took action on collaborating, setting ambitious targets at a regional level, prioritizing Indigenous-led conservation, completing existing work, identifying new protected areas in a meaningful way, which is to say using science and Indigenous knowledges, enhancing connectivity, uplifting Indigenous efforts and using reconciliation, protecting carbon-rich ecosystems and habitat for species at risk, and lastly, maintaining or increasing long-term funding for stability of conservation efforts. And so what did we find across Canada? Well, governments varied dramatically in their contributions to both the quantity and quality of protected areas. And we use this report card grading system because we found it to be both an effective carrot and stick to governments in the past. And also we feel like it gets a little bit of media traction too. So grades ranged from A- in Quebec to F for its next door neighbor in Ontario, where I'm from. And the Government of Canada grades are at the top corner there for terrestrial protection and for ocean protection. I should also mention that we didn't grade Nunavut in the north or Prince Edward Island in the east, as we don't have chapters there, and our work was done in collaboration with our chapters. So over time, since our last report card in 2021, the biggest changes were in British Columbia and Manitoba, and this was really due to bold commitments, collaboration with federal and Indigenous partners, and support for the work of Indigenous nations. And you can see the group on the right that we call laggards, unfortunately, haven't really moved very much in the past few years. And that's largely due to a lack of political will and prioritization of industrial development in non-nature friendly ways. Our federal government's efforts have held pretty steady, which is quite positive. And we saw a slight decline in the grade or simply the effort from the federal government for terrestrial conservation. And this was largely due to a lack of long-term funding commitment. And this is something that our organization is advocating for very strongly with our incoming government. So the question that everybody asks, what does this mean in terms of area? Again, there's a huge range of results here. You can see on this graph that the Yukon is 2/3 of the way to 30% terrestrial protection. Federal ocean protection is halfway there in Canada. Quebec is doing very well. So is BC, although there are some question marks around the OECM's meeting standards. And then there's places like Prince Edward Island with its high percentage of private land ownership, and it's always going to struggle to meet the 30% target, and that's really understandable. And this is only one reason amongst many that the quantitative metric doesn't present a full picture of conservation actions and progress across Canada. Consequently, and in consideration of the language in Target 3, CPAWS also really wanted to continue emphasizing quality and equity of actions in creating protected areas and ensure that these elements are maintained going forward. So from our review across the country, we gained insight into what has worked, and we hope that sharing this will continue to promote good conservation activity. And although each provincial and territorial government faces its own regional challenges and opportunities, the following conclusions apply to all jurisdictions, and we hope also across North America. So continuing with ambitious goals, scaled up investments and support for Indigenous stewardship will keep conservation momentum strong through to 2030 and beyond. We discovered, and I think this is not news to anybody in this room, that good conservation takes time due to the need for strong relationships, inclusive planning, and full partnership with Indigenous rights holders. Federal financial support has leveraged additional investments from provinces and territories where ambitious conservation commitments have provided a positive feedback loop. And here's kind of the crux of it. We feel that achieving Canada's 30 by 30 target is possible, but it requires sustained federal funding, including renewed support for critical long-term programs. And this means dollars for both establishment and ongoing co-management. Complexity is a barrier, so simplifying funding processes and building trust-based models will accelerate results for many Indigenous partners, groups, and communities across the country. Investing in Indigenous-led preliminary planning work like land use planning and marine spatial planning is essential. This is true even where our subnational, i.e. provincial and territorial governments, do not yet support the protection of lands and waters. It's really important to build this foundation of knowledge and relationships that can generate results in the longer term. Implementing approaches and policies, legislative tools that support and recognize Indigenous-led conservation initiatives and government models will improve all outcomes. I think we heard this morning that there haven't been any new IPCAs formally recognized in the last few years, so that's quite disappointing. Focusing on quality and equity means concentrating on protecting carbon-rich ecosystems and areas of importance for biodiversity, ensuring that all ecosystem types are represented in conservation networks. Working in full partnerships with Indigenous governments and communities will also ensure protection of culturally important areas. Canada's a really big country. Conservation strategies really have to be tailored to regional needs, which are different from coast to coast to coast. And lastly, it's essential that all current and future terrestrial and marine sites contributing to Canada's conservation targets, including OECMs, are robustly protected and managed effectively to meet international and our national standards for quality and equity. So if we can do all of that, or even some of it, we can ensure Canada reaches 30 by 30. It's really simple, right? So that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Before we dive into our conversation, I just want to remind all of you that you are free and encouraged to enter some questions into your app. I have that in front of me so I can see any of the questions you pull up, and I'll do my best to try and pull in some of your questions if you guys put some in there. So coming back to the three of you, sometimes we think, we build these big targets, 2030, 30 by 30, in part, I think that target time-wise happened because it sounded cool, 30 by 30. Like, I don't know that there was a real necessity of 2030, but that is coming up really quickly. And I'd love to hear from each of you, sort of reflect a little bit about the fact that we don't have that much time left to reach that goal, and maybe hear a little bit about your thoughts from your work and your perspectives about what are the consequences if we don't meet those targets within this time frame. What happens if we overshoot?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think it's similar to climate change. We're unlikely to hit the 1.5 degrees. We're probably already blowing past this. But just like climate, where every bit of reduction in emissions matters, the same with conservation. Every bit matters. And so if we don't hit 30% by 2030, is that a failure? Well, it's a failure to meet that specific target, but is it a failure for conservation that we've reset the global agenda and the paradigm discussion of the scale of conservation and the pace of conservation that needs to happen? No, that's a big victory. We've changed the idea that we need to dramatically accelerate conservation, that we need to do it in a different way. And we've seen in the United States, the America the Beautiful for All coalition, a recognition that we need to do conservation in a way that has more inclusivity and equity involved in it, that it has to be more tribally led. That's been a big victory for it. We've seen more private philanthropy in conservation than in the history of the United States because of the 30 by 30 target. And we're seeing huge areas being designated in countries around the world. We had a slow start because of COVID, so what was supposed to be a 10-year plan, actually we didn't get the agreement agreed to even until a few years later. So I don't know if we will meet the target. I think we're going to do our best to do it, but I think that every bit we make towards it matters. The goal of creating that target was to reset things and to have a target that was commensurate with the challenge of the problems of climate change and biodiversity loss. And so that's why you needed something at that scale and a deadline. So it's important to make as much progress as we can towards this. Will the world end if we don't? No, but we will lose some species and we will lose some great places. So every bit of failure to do that does mean some real consequences for biodiversity, but it also means that if we don't, every bit towards it is also a benefit. So we need to look at it in both of those ways, in my mind.
Yes, and to complement, I just want to give you some figures. So 30 by 30 is a global target, but every single country is taking it personally into their national realities. So Canada has 13% terrestrial and 9% coastal marine conserved, Mexico 15% terrestrial, 22% coastal marine, and the US 13% and 19%. So we're not quite there. I don't think we will get as a region to 30 by 30, but instead of getting to 30 by 30, how about securing what we already have? How about ensuring that we won't have paper parks by the end of this decade? So again, an emphasis on quality, but also understanding that conservation outside of protected areas can be recognized, strengthened, and secured. So if we're going to go into OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, how to make sure that we also understand those motivations for people to engage in conservation efforts, and that we will be securing those territories and not only counting them towards a target, but actually securing them from further land use change or overexploitation. And also conservation finance. I think that we will be talking about that more tomorrow, but conservation finance both ways, top down and bottom up, to make sure that we are having sustainable solutions in the long term that will not be dependent on national budgets, on federal public budgets. And finally, to make sure that we're making progress towards the 30 by 30, making sure that we also are addressing this from a science-based perspective. And I just want to quote Phil, who said in his op-ed in the New York Times recently, "Science is only as resilient as the people who refuse to let it die." We need to make sure that we are making decisions based on the best science, science-driven, to make sure that there is representativity, not only from an ecological side, but also socially.
Yeah, I would agree with so much of that. I think maybe the question from our perspective is not what's the consequence of not reaching 30 by 30, but it's the consequence of losing momentum. We don't want to see backsliding on, as you said, we don't want to create paper parks. We don't want to see areas that have been protected have less meaningful management actions. We really want to see ongoing co-management by involvement of local Indigenous people or led by them. And I think you know, the search for mysterious OECMs, like there's been work in our country around, you know, just magically hoping that there's going to be more numbers to add to the database. And I think that's maybe not quite the right focus. We really want to think about the spaces and what meaning that those particular places have, whether it's cultural, social, or really based in biodiverse areas, or carbon-rich landscapes. So I think the target is a lovely thing to have. It provides motivation, and it certainly brings an element of like financial motivation into it as well as political will. But I feel like it's really keeping the momentum going around the quality and equity piece that's critically important in Canada.
I'd love to build on that for a second, and something I think, Kirsten, you and Lucia touched on this quite a bit in your opening talking points. In our last symposium, we heard this phrase a couple times, that progress and success moves at the speed of trust. And in thinking about the fact that we've set this deadline, and you know, all of you have sort of evoked that importance of collaboration and relationship building, there's a tension between trying to build the relationships and the necessary time to do that, and the urgency around halting and reversing biodiversity loss. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about how maybe that tension shows up for you in your work, or where you've seen success in sort of balancing some of that tension.
I think that's really well said. Whenever you have a global goal or a national goal, in some ways it's going to be, you know, that's top down, and that's a challenge in conservation. In my career, I always like to work on bottom-up conservation and working with communities. But when we saw the scale of loss of biodiversity and the pace of loss, the ability to do in order to reset that and to have this kind of global vision of the scale, you need to have something that's kind of global or national, just to let people recognize that the damage we're facing on the biodiversity crisis. That doesn't mean that the solution should be top down. It means maybe the goal and the vision can be something that broad, but then how that's achieved has to be bottom up. The timeline does create a challenge for inclusivity, for consultation. We know that trust takes a long time. But you look on the flip side of this, I just mentioned the litany of things that the Trump administration is doing, a full wrecking ball to the environmental laws without any public consultation whatsoever. So we're facing the situation where we will see on one side a complete destruction of nature with no public process. And on our side, sometimes we tie ourselves in knots over a public process. So we've got to find some balance between recognizing that we are in a true emergency here. We are losing species, we are losing places incredibly rapidly with the complexity of climate change topped on to biodiversity loss. That doesn't forgive us from the responsibility for working with communities, for doing free, prior, and informed consent, for ensuring that we are building trust. But it does mean that we need to cut out our own bureaucratic red tape where we can and recognize that we need to move quickly. It is a huge challenge in conservation. I wish we had decades to build that trust and to do things across the board. But I think at some places we may build trust or spend processes that we lose the window to conserve areas disappears. Not for every place, but for some places. So that's a tension that I live with every day. I'm sure all of you in this room live with every day, and I don't have a good answer for it, unfortunately, other than to do our best to this and to do it with an open heart and a willingness to try to do our best for consultation and inclusivity, recognizing the urgency we face.
Just adding to that as well, good news first. The Green Climate Fund has considered now that protected areas should be one of their core indicators and not only be considered as co-benefits. So protected and conserved areas are actually going atop of priorities. And I think that's a good thing coming from a multilateral funding that is focused on climate change. We are doing this cross-cutting opportunity between targets and between agendas. And the second thing is also about being patient. We are humans and trust takes time. If we were to think about the concept of protected areas 100 years ago, it didn't exist. It was actually national parks that existed. And we want to get OECMs right in 5 years? I don't think so. So I believe that if we want to really have these conversations, we need to be patient with ourselves, with the people that we are working with, and make sure that we consider this as processes that will deliver long-term conservation outcomes without necessarily reporting it immediately. So where are those highlights that we want to make sure that those are small wins that will contribute to long-term conservation outcomes without necessarily reporting it at a global level, but that we know that we're having that impact at a local scale?
Yeah, and I think connected to that and what you said about like we're people, I think it's recognizing in cases where we maybe haven't gotten it quite right and learning from that and changing our approach a little bit. And I'm not sure, like we're so fixated on getting to this number that it's just like build on top, you know, like each area has to be another new thing, and we aren't maybe being reflective. So the patience element and learning from what we've done we haven't kind of carried that forward. So I think we can work on that a little bit. To your question, Jen, around where does the tension come in, I think we see it with resourcing a lot, and we hear our chapters hear from groups that they've been working with for a long time, building these relationships. These are the areas that need protecting. The knowledge is there, you know, the community knowledge, the indigenous knowledge, the traditional knowledge, the science, it's there. We understand where the areas are for the most part. But then the frustration comes through in, well, okay, how do we now actually make this happen? We don't necessarily have resources to do it. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you know, Canada is quite reliant on federal funding. Long-term programs need renewal every 5 years or so. That's quite challenging when we have this 4-year electoral cycle. And so the piece around conservation financing and bringing that in, I think, is becoming increasingly more important to reduce that tension around resourcing to actually activate the knowledge we have about the areas and create real protection for them.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was awesome. I'm going to shift gears, and I'm going to take a question from the audience. Is the current continental focus on economics and tariffs a distraction from our conservation policy commitments, or could it be an opportunity? And if so, how? And I guess this sort of builds on this thread of conversation that we've had, that this pivot moment or this political moment is influencing the work that we do, whether or not we want it to or not. And I'd just be curious to hear your reactions to that question of policy, the tariffs and economics sort of changing our conversation a little.
I think it's an opportunity for us to remind the public of the interconnected nature of our countries, of our continent. We obviously have this massive interconnected economic portfolio. Just we are all reliant on each other for our jobs and our economies. That's been built over decades. But imagine that if we use that as an entree point to talk to the public who's thinking about the interconnectedness we have on economics, to get them to think about something that they don't always think about, which is the interconnectedness we have of biodiversity. There is a professor and author at the University of Georgia, Dorinda Dahlmeyer, who says, it's the environmental boundaries and not the arbitrary political boundaries that birds, fish, and other migratory species recognize and respect. After all, birds, butterflies, and aquatic organisms exist in a three-dimensional fluid medium that does not square neatly with our concepts of property law and boundary drawing. I think never really thought about it as, birds and butterflies in this kind of three-dimensional fluid medium, but it makes sense. And our economies in some ways are similar. So if we can make that connection between the interconnectedness we have as a continent economically to the ecological connectivity and the need for cooperation, that may provide an opportunity for us going forward.
I would go back also to the concept of ecosystem services and hydrological ecosystem services. Our continent is connected by water. And how can we go back also to rescue some of the efforts that have been done at a national level on natural capital accounting? If we are able to show that natural capital accounting is contributing to the economics of our countries and of our region, we can generate then incentives that could counter those tariffs. So I believe that it's not a very straightforward way, but if we are able to demonstrate the economic value at a transboundary level of some of the ecosystem services that we all depend on, then we can generate the incentives, but also to make sure that we are including people in those decision-making processes.
Yeah, I think our incoming Prime Minister said, "Build, baby, build," in his election victory speech recently. And, you know, there's an opportunity there for us to try and shift this narrative. It doesn't have to be an either-or debate around economy or environment. We are really trying to make it an and conversation. So we need a healthy environment and clean water to prosper. These are fundamental. Biodiversity is fundamental to our national, local, regional economies. And so this is really what we're trying to bring into our conversation with the public and with decision makers and politicians in Canada. And we've been trying to spread the message that nature isn't a left or right issue, and it's going to be critical to everybody going forward. So I feel like although we are in this economic and tariff debate, it is an opportunity to revitalize the conversation around biodiversity protection.
I'm going to take one more question from the audience, and then we're going to wrap up real quickly. So we have a question from the audience. Given there are 22 other targets that are not area-based, are there other areas for biodiversity where North America is doing well? And we've touched a little bit on some of the relationship-building pieces of it, but I'm curious to hear about some of those other 22 targets, if you guys have any thoughts on where we have some strengths in those in North America.
Sure. Just to put an example in Mexico related to Target 18, which talk about harmful subsidies. Mexico has been able to do some things related to planning on how to repurpose harmful subsidies for example, nature-positive fisheries. So that's one example at a very low scale or a very local scale. But I do believe that we have great examples that if we were to map them out here, we could be contributing. Also with the PFPs, definitely Target 19 on resource mobilization and closing the biodiversity financial gap. But if we talk about Target 3 and area-based conservation, we should also be thinking about Targets 1, 2, and 3 as a bundle of targets and not only Target 3 independently. So Target 1 related to land and sea use planning, and Target 2 related to restoration. We need to have this holistic landscape, seascape approach to make sure that we are not thinking about protected and conserved areas as these isolated places, but within complex landscapes.
Yeah, I think Canada's maybe been focused very strongly on Target 3 without thinking about other pieces. There has been a little bit of work on harmful subsidies. CPAWS was really kind of pushing forward on that. We have a report in the works on that. I think the federal government has looked into it a little bit. I think folks in Quebec and the provincial government are starting to think about Target 10, working landscape kind of things. But yeah, it's been a little bit of tunnel vision, unfortunately, so I think there's opportunity there to think more broadly about all of the things in an integrated way.
I'd add the targets on Indigenous rights. I think that while not perfect, I think that each of the three countries, less so now with obviously the Trump administration, have started to take that seriously and recognize that these are intertwined, that you cannot achieve your biodiversity framework without advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities and respecting those rights and conservation. And that's positive movement that we've seen in North America. We haven't seen that same progress in some other parts of the world where there's still massive violations. Not to say that there aren't in North America, but that we've seen at least an attempt to address and do reconciliation as part of conservation, which is admirable, and we're on a pathway that's moving in the right direction on that target, which I think is an example of where other countries should be following.
Great. As we wrap up in the last few minutes here, I want to close on one of my favorite quotations, a paraphrase from Maya Angelou. Do the best that you can. When you learn more, do better. And so I'm curious to hear from each of you, just rapid fire, what are the touch points where you hope we will do better in the next couple of years?
I hope we'll do better in investing in grassroots communities. You know, I've worked on a global target, but in most of my career is working in local communities. And I feel like too often foundations and other organizations kind of chase issues and invest in things a year at a time, but we've seen, at least in the United States, the need to build power, and we need to build long-term power, and so that means investing in the grassroots and staying true to those communities and building power for the long term versus kind of chasing issue by issue, and so that's what I'm hoping we can do better on.
Collaboration, dialogue, and active listening. And one way to get there is also to make sure that organizations as WWF and other big organizations develop mechanisms for direct access to markets and direct access to finance without us serving as intermediaries, but actually us serving as facilitators of those direct access.
I would say, as cliched as it might sound, it's on the collaboration piece and working together, whether that's across industry, bringing ENGOs and industry together in the same room. It can feel really uncomfortable, but I think there is common ground to be found there. Or whether it's bringing together folks who are working on terrestrial and freshwater conservation with people who are working on ocean conservation. We see in Canada, because of the way our legal jurisdictions tend to work, there's a big gap in coastal conservation efforts. So I think all of those kind of multiple layers of collaboration, that's where we can work more strongly.
Well, thank you so much. Please thank our speakers. This has been a fabulous conversation. And we'll move on to our next speakers now.